Why does it say off? Hi, and welcome back to Book Club of One. Today we're going to be going through the responses to Phenomenal Conservatism from the other authors of Defending Religious Epistemology. The first respondent we have is DEPOE, our classical evidentialist. Now, if you watch the classical evidentialist videos, you're probably going to suspect that his objection to phenomenal conservatism is that it doesn't have an objective enough tie to truth, right? He's going to say, my view, classical evidentialism, is objectively linked to truth because every belief that we have has got to ultimately, somewhere down the line, be justified by a foundational belief that's incorrigible, that has to be true, that it's impossible for you to doubt. Whereas on phenomenal conservatism, some of your foundational beliefs you can believe just because they seem true, and that's not a firm enough, tight enough connection to being true. So that's essentially his entire response is, look, there's no reason to think that seemings are tied to the truth, or even that seemings have an adversity to being false. Very frequently, things seem to us to be true for no good reason at all. False things seem frequently to be true. And he's going to give us a couple of examples, but the main one is, what if you're on a jury and you just have a gut feeling that the defendant seems guilty? On phenomenal conservatism, it seems like that gut feeling counts as evidence against the defendant. And so, at least, if you're on the edge, right, if you're right at the point where, based on the evidence presented, he might be guilty, he might not be guilty, then your seeming that he seems guilty to you ought to tip the scale. But that doesn't seem right. It seems to him... wow, what a use of that term. It seems to DEPOE that if your seemings are based on something that's going to give you evidence, well, then all the better. You can use those underlying things as evidence. But DEPOE is going to present an alternate account of what a seeming is. DEPOE thinks seemings are sort of secondary psychological states. When we contemplate the evidence we have at our disposal, then seemings arise on the basis of the evidence that we're contemplating. But the seeming itself isn't evidence. Now, it's pretty frequent that seemings are caused by good reasons for things. Seemings are caused by good evidence that give us good reasons to believe something. But the seeming itself is not a good reason to believe, because sometimes seemings are caused by things that aren't good reasons, that are just wishful thinking, or this, that, or the other thing. And so if we examine our seemings, and it turns out that they're based on, wishful thinking or something like that, well, then they don't give us any reason, and they never did, even before we examined them for their underlying psychological underpinnings. According to DEPOE, the goal, the purpose of epistemology is to give us tools to evaluate the grounds for our seemings, not to give our seemings weight, right? The reason we study epistemology is so that we have some tools to look at those things that are grounding our seemings, that are making things seem to us to be true, and to determine whether or not they're good or not. Giving our seemings evidential weight is just ridiculous for DEPOE. Okay, so beyond that, beyond his basic primary response, which is seemings don't have an objective connection to truth, for any given seeming, it's just as likely that the thing that seems to us to be true is false as it is to be true. He's also going to say that there's a more basic problem with the phenomenal conservative definition of justification, in that it's circular. If you remember our video, when we talked about justification, we said that something is going to be justified for us if it seems true, but there are no defeaters for it. But that concept of defeaters has an idea of justification baked into it, right? A defeater requires justification in and of itself. So our definition of justification is referencing within itself something that needs justification, and so it seems to be circular. It's like saying a belief is justified if it seems true and we don't have justification for thinking it's false. And so since it says justification twice, it's circular, and so we ought to dismiss the justification. Finally, DEPOE is going to have issues with the application of this epistemology to God beliefs in particular. So he says, just like with his example of on the jury, suppose it seems to some that they have equal evidence for both sides, for both theism and atheism, but then they have a seeming that tips the balance, right? So some of the evidence says God exists, some of the evidence doesn't say God exists. They're right at the point of agnosticism, but it seems to them like God exists. So on phenomenal conservatism, they have some additional evidence, and they think that God exists on the basis of just the seeming. But once again, he points out, the seeming isn't objectively linked with truth. If on inspection, the person finds no deeper reason for the seeming, he doesn't have any reason to accept it as evidence, just because it doesn't make his view any more likely. Seemings, this is the bottom line, seemings for DEPOE are explained always by evidence, and they aren't themselves evidence. They're just a psychological state that arrives in response to evidence. The second response to phenomenal conservatism is only a page, maybe a page and a half, but there's not much at all. The proper functionalist response to phenomenal conservatism is basically, this fits with us. There's not too much of a difference here. I guess the 2 points that he makes in this page-long response are, 1, we might differ a little bit. So first he's going to say, look, we basically agree. We both think that if something seems true to the theist, like the existence of God, then they have justification for believing it. Okay. Where might we disagree a little bit? Well, we might disagree on how important natural theology is. So, like, let's say you are exposed to the argument from evil. Well, MCNABB is going to say he's not convinced that most mature theists are going to need to be familiar with natural theology to rebuff this objection. He's just going to say that, look, if your belief is produced by a system that is delivering you true beliefs, and a seeming defeater comes up, you might not even need really good arguments against that defeater. You have 2 pieces of evidence, and if the seeming is produced correctly and is strong enough, then yeah, it can outweigh arguments against it. So that's MCNABB's first thing he's going to say. Second thing he's going to say is that he thinks the views are entirely compatible. So he doesn't think that this internalist-externalist divide thing is a deal breaker. He's going to say, okay, your account of justification, or justification is based on seemings, is entirely right. You didn't even try to give an account of knowledge. What Plantinga's trying to do, what I, MCNABB, am trying to do, what us proper functionalists are trying to do is not provide an account of justification at all. We're trying to provide an account of warrant, which is the thing that makes something go from just being a justified true belief to being knowledge. Warrant is going to tell us how a seeming is objectively tied to truth, or not. Warrant is the objective connection bit. And you're completely right that from like a person's subjective perspective, it's the seeming that's going to be the evidence for them. But then the question is, how do we know they actually know this, right? Maybe the seeming is produced by entirely faulty mechanisms or something. Well, maybe warrant, maybe like the objective tie between the faculties that produce the seeming and truth is the important bit. So, yeah, he doesn't even raise the issues I had with the sort of presentation of issues with Plantinga's view, which was sort of something that threw me off in the initial article. MCNABB basically just says, hey, we're in agreement. You gave an account of justification, I give an account of warrant. They're two different things, but our views are entirely compatible. I'm just not as sure as you are that a mature Christian is going to need to have access to a bunch of natural theology to rebuff potential defeaters for his position. Next, we have the Covenantal Epistemology response to Phenomenal Conservatism. He basically is going to express some of the same concerns as DEPOE. And I think he's going to express them a bit better. I think he's going to make a slightly more convincing case with them, at least just for my taste. Just the style he presented, even though it's essentially the exact same point. I'm going to voice again here my sort of just dislike of the way he writes and the sort of arguments he makes. And I'm also going to point out a way I think there is to resolve some of his issues with phenomenal conservatism if you take sort of the reformed epistemologist, the proper functionalist stance of the last respondent. Okay, so Scott Oliphant is going to, the covenantal epistemologist, is going to start by pointing out the same issue DEPOE did, that our non-inferential beliefs, our foundational beliefs that aren't based on other arguments, they're person relative, and they might not be grounded in reality, right? Things seem different ways to different people. So if different people have different seemings, how is it that these different seemings all provide justification? Or put another way, does reality actually back up and support these seemings? And if it doesn't, how can they provide any evidence if they're not objective? And then he's going to go into his thing about how he grounds it. Right? He's going to say, look, we're made in the image of God. God gives us rulership over creation. And in order to rule over creation, in order for Adam and Eve to name the animals, first they have to know the animals. So our knowledge of the world is found in this sort of covenantal relationship between God and us and the world. God gives us knowledge of the world. So as far as it goes, we can trust our seemings about creation, about nature, just on the basis of this covenant we have. And furthermore, God reveals himself to us through the world. We look around the world and it provides evidence, undeniable, incredibly strong evidence in Oliphant's view, that there's definitely a God. And to borrow language Oliphant doesn't use, but to borrow proper functionalist language, if our faculties are functioning properly, then viewing the world around us is going to create true seemings in us that this was all created by God. So he's going to say, as far as it goes, he thinks that phenomenal conservatism is right then. Insofar as people do have seemings that God exists and is real and is loving and is all-powerful, it seems true to them by looking around at the outside world, that does provide justification for their beliefs. But Oliphant is going to say, people are sinful, and they do everything they can to suppress this truth. They dodge every which way, and they do mental gymnastics to reject God's existence, which is utterly obvious to us. People purposely then skew their seemings to the point where it no longer seems true to them that God exists. Now, these anti-theists, these ungod seemings, don't provide any justification, and they can't. Now, this is where I think just taking a proper functionalist sort of view, a MCNABB, Plantinga sort of view, resolves the conflict entirely, right? Because you get to make that distinction between warrant and justification, right? You can say, well, then if God exists, and it is true that our senses, when they function properly, and our faculties, when they function properly, create beliefs that God does exist, well, then we don't actually have warrant to believe he doesn't exist, even if it seems to us that he doesn't exist, when those beliefs are produced by malfunctioning faculties. You may still be... So, Oliphant is going to say you're not even justified because those justifications aren't tied to truth, whereas what a proper functionalist might do is say, no, you're justified, right? Like, it's not like you're being irrational, but your belief doesn't have warrant because it's not properly tied to reality. Might sort of be the response there on the phenomenal conservative fusion with proper functionalism / reformed epistemology. But yeah, that's basically Scott Oliphant's response is, okay, yeah, sure, seemings that God exists provide justification. Seemings that God doesn't exist don't provide justification because they're not formed in the appropriate way to link them to truth. But seemings that God does exist are formed in an appropriate way linked to truth. So, yeah, they can provide justification. And because of our covenant with God, a lot of our seemings about the external world are connected to truth on the basis of this covenant. Next, we move on to Eric Baldwin's critique of phenomenal conservatism. Baldwin is the person who takes the tradition-based perspectival view, which is the view in the book that I have the least grasp of, the least comprehension of, even after reading his chapter, and the one that I most need to do additional research into. That said, I really like his critique so far, his critique of DEPOE, and his critique of Gage and McAllister. So let's get into this one. So first he's going to point out a large amount of agreement that he has with the phenomenal conservative view. He thinks that, on his view, endoxa are sort of analogous to seemings, maybe not exactly the same, but they serve sort of the same role, and they're definitely similar. So endoxa are sort of these, let's say, received opinions or common sense beliefs. They're sort of the things we start with on his view, but they sort of come from the traditions we're in, I guess we'll say. And it's sort of like an Aristotelian idea. So he thinks that belief in God can depend on arguments, but doesn't necessarily need to depend on arguments in order to be rational. He thinks that evidence matters for your belief in God. Whether your belief in God is based on arguments or not, it's going to be based on evidence. He thinks that different experiences you have, religious experiences, or even something like a seeming, can provide evidence for your religious belief. And he agrees with the definition of seeming that is given, seemings being assertive experiences with propositional content, and that the seemings are not just reducible to beliefs or inclinations. But where he takes issue is whether or not seemings can ground our beliefs, whether or not they're really foundational beliefs in the sense that, like, foundationalists think of them. He doesn't think they are good regress stoppers, right? So when we discussed in the introduction video our two different general views, coherentism and foundationalism, foundationalists think that at some point you go far enough back in our beliefs and you get to things that aren't based on other further back beliefs. And so they sort of stop infinite regresses of beliefs being based on other beliefs. And coherentists think that if you go back far enough, you get to a belief, and that belief is... You can't have an infinite number of beliefs in the coherentist's view, but eventually you get back around to the first belief. Our beliefs sort of hang together in a mesh and are mutually supporting on the coherentist view. And he doesn't think that seemings are a good candidate for what the basic beliefs are on a foundationalist view. And he gives two reasons for this. The first is that when we look at our seemings, they have different sort of phenomenology that grounds why things seem true. Right? When you have a seeming, there's something about it that makes it seem true. It's not just that it seems true with no context. So he gives two examples, one of introspection and one of memory. So when we introspect, there's sort of an intentionality about it. There's a directedness to it, awareness of our thinking and our thoughts, sort of self-reflexiveness to introspecting. And the beliefs we have that we gain from introspection, the things that seem true in light of those particular experiences. What it seems like to do not what it seems like to do introspection, but the experience, the phenomenology of introspection is what causes the introspective beliefs to seem true. If that phenomenology were different, if introspecting felt different to us, the things that we introspected about, the beliefs we gained that way wouldn't seem true. Same with memory. So memory often involves a sort of, he quotes Plantinga here actually, sort of sensuous imagery, sort of sense or feeling of pastness. It's about the subject of the memory and memorying something. That's not a word. Remembering something. When we remember something, we recognize whatever remembering as a memory. And that sort of phenomenology, those things that it's like to remember something, those are the things that in light of those things, we have a seeming that the memory is a true memory of an actual past event. The truth here, so he's going to say that there are things on the basis of which our seemings seem true to us. Now he's going to point out that on his view, and this is also probably true of the proper functionalist view, the truth here isn't grounded in our subjective mental states. That's not really where the justification is coming from, but rather the justification is coming from the intellect grasping a real essence. He's sort of trying to do a Thomistic epistemology here, which, like he talked about in the DEPOE response, we're justified in light of our intellect grasping a real essence in the world. And he thinks, like we talked about again in the DEPOE chapter, that this can happen without us grasping a direct awareness of whatever process it is on which we base the truth, which is why he does think seemings can provide evidence for things, right? He thinks something can seem true to us. We don't have to fully grasp what that seeming is based on in order for the seeming to give us evidence. But it is still the case that the seeming is based on something further underlying beneath. Okay, second reason for being dubious that seemings are fundamental is that we can actually explain why we have a seeming. We can reflect upon a particular seeming we have, and we can dredge up arguments that we had, but we didn't realize we had, that support the argument. He's going to give the first of a couple of different examples he gives here, but he's going to talk about astrology and the tradition of astrology, which he views as sort of a fossil science, is the term he uses. Once upon a time, in the ancient past, people believed astrology was a good way of knowing things about the future and the world. And it seemed to people in that tradition as though astrology was true. And then as time moved on, we got better tools to learn about the world. And it still seems to some people today that astrology does provide accurate predictions about the future. But of course, those seemings today probably don't actually justify their belief, right? It's incumbent upon them to look at those seemings, analyze them, and figure out why they're true. Well, not why they're true, why they seem true to them, but then to reject them, because there are better systems that have developed since then that have displaced astrology as a sort of valid tradition to be doing work in. So one thing we ought to do to our seemings is expose them to sort of radical external criticism and rational critique in order to figure out whether or not they're true or not. So for example, with our religious experiences, we might realize that people in different religious traditions have different religious experiences that they take to sort of ground their beliefs. And so that diversity of religious opinion might give us a reason to expose our religious beliefs to this sort of critique. And until we do that, it seems as though, we might have a good sort of defeater. I'm not with a lot of Baldwin's chapters, it's kind of hard to see where exactly he disagrees. This is including with the DEPOE chapter. A lot of this seems like it fits okay with phenomenal conservatism, and as though Gage and McAllister might actually agree with a good deal of this. Baldwin's going to go on to say, when you have this sort of extreme doubt of whatever system you were working within before, like Christianity or astrology or whatever, when you have this sort of epistemological crisis, you start to doubt what counts as evidence and even what sort of interpretive schema you should use to evaluate evidence, to evaluate what counts as evidence in the first place. So the second example he's going to give, beyond the astrology one, is also astronomical in nature. So he says, imagine you're an astronomer living around the time of Copernicus. You've been working under the Ptolemaic system for a long time, right? Putting the Earth as the center and doing your calculations based on that. And now this Copernican view comes along and you're still making your observations, but you're not sure how to interpret them anymore. You're not sure which framework is actually correct. And you're trying to... You don't know what your evidence means because you don't know which broader, greater system is correct. And so as time goes on, we realize that the Copernican system, right, the heliocentric one with the sun at the center of the solar system, better makes sense of the data, right? There's we should read some Karl Popper sometime, man. But there's he's doing sort of a scientific epistemology, a sort of history of science thing here. There's a bunch of errors that build up under the Ptolemaic system, a bunch of little add-ons and addendums to it in order to correct for things that the system didn't predict correctly. And then the Copernican system comes along and is much more parsimonious and explains the data a lot better without all these little tacked-on add-ons. And so eventually the old system, the old tradition that the people would operate in is rejected in favor of a new one. And so he's going to point out here that your seemings are rooted in whatever tradition you're in. If you're working in the Ptolemaic tradition, your seemings are going to be that the Earth is the center, and you're going to explain the data you're observing in the sky in light of that tradition, because that's the tradition you're taking part in. Final example he's going to give here is Christianity and Buddhism, right? So Christians and Buddhists are both going to take part in belief-forming practices, right? Christians are going to go to church, they're going to take communion, they're going to pray, and they're going to form beliefs that they're in connection with, the God of classical theism or something like classical theism. Whereas Buddhists are going to meditate, they're going to do certain things, and they're going to form the belief that they're achieving nirvana eventually as they grasp Buddhist concepts more fully. And so then the question becomes, how do you evaluate which tradition is correct when you're comparing them and you're trying to decide between the two of them? You have to sort of try to remove yourself and look at them from outside the tradition and determine which one better explains the evidence. Right, so he gives an example then of a Christian metaphysic based on being, and a Buddhist metaphysic based on, how do I even pronounce this? This is not something I'm familiar with Sunyata. The metaphysics are clearly incompatible, and somebody who's equally at home in a Christian tradition and a Buddhist tradition might be in like a boundary situation, right? It might be as though for them, their seemings equally make both different metaphysics seem equally true, even though they're incompatible. And so then careful philosophical inquiry is going to be important for them to ultimately make a decision about which one they think is really true and which tradition to continue working in and living in and using to make sense of the world around them. Ultimately, we're going to make progress toward truth by transcending and correcting for the distortions and limitations of our starting points. That's a quote I'm reading from the book right there. And so these things we're correcting include the way things seem to us. So he thinks seemings can provide an okay starting point for philosophical inquiry. What seems to us to be true, okay, we can start there. But we really shouldn't stop there, and the seemings can't provide ultimate justification for our views. They're not equipped for that. That's not what they're for. They're an okay starting point, but they're not rock bottom. And what we're going to do in the end is we're going to look at like our whole system and our whole other system. And even though we might not have a defeater for one explicitly, like a specific defeater, we're going to pick one based on which has better explanatory power, is sort of what he... Okay, so how do Gage and McAllister respond to all of this on behalf of phenomenal conservatism? Well, they recognize 5 general arguments that are brought against them. So first, they're going to address a small thing from McNabb's short little one-page piece. They say, okay, McNabb thinks that we require too much of the average believer. We require they know some natural theology, and that's a bit much. It seems as though we're ruling out a bunch of people from being justified in their religious beliefs who McNabb thinks are justified. Second argument they recognize is what they find in Baldwin, what they find in the view we just went over, which is that seemings can't be the ultimate justification for our beliefs because they're, if you examine them closely, reliant on prior things. Then DEPOE, again, or I guess not again, this is the first DEPOE response, but DEPOE they're going to respond to multiple times in here. DEPOE argues that they're too liberal. They allow too many beliefs in that we don't want to have justified. It seems odd to have anything that seems true at all to be a justified belief. John Buck actually left a comment on the last video, noting that this was his primary concern with the view. Maybe like a stray hunch that pops in your head can justify a belief about something, which seems odd. It seems really weird if these bare seemings can justify a belief. Fourthly, Gage and McAllister want to address, here again we have DEPOE, they want to address DEPOE's circularity argument. Remember we said that DEPOE points out that the way they define justification mentions defeaters, which require knowing what justification is to know what a defeater is. And finally, they want to address Oliphant, Baldwin, and DEPOE's concern. They're going to say everyone except for McNabb has this concern that hunches, or not hunches, but seemings don't have the right sort of connection to the truth. We're not objectively sure enough of the truth of our seemings for them to justify our beliefs, right? That the connection isn't strong enough. We don't know for a fact that our seemings are true. Okay, so let's start with concern number one, the idea that it's asking too much of believers to have some knowledge of natural theology to overcome defeaters. So Gage and McAllister take McNabb's response to be something like, our design plan, our faculties are such that an adult believer, someone who's been a believer all their life, is going to have a super strong theistic seeming. And this super strong seeming of God's existence is just going to overwhelm like any sort of objections that they might come across, right? They might wonder sometimes, well, I have religious seemings, but so do other religious believers, or there's problems with evil in this world. They might have those defeaters arise, but those defeaters aren't just going to be strong enough to overcome this super powerful seeming, right? And Gage and McAllister are just going to say, look, we don't think that the theistic seeming, at least initially, is that strong. Defeaters are going to pose a serious problem with it, and you can't just dismiss the arguments against God or the defeaters for God's existence in the same way you might dismiss a plausible argument against your own existence or against the existence of the external world, right? Those are super strong seemings, like the seeming that you exist or the seeming that the external world exists. Those seemings are so strong that even if you get a really good argument against them, you might be justified in holding on to that seeming because it's just so incredibly strong. Even if you don't know how to get out of the argument against the existence of the external world or the argument against your own existence, your seeming's really strong. Gage and McAllister, the phenomenal conservativists, are not at all convinced that our seeming that God exists is that strong. They use the example of a kid going to church camp. They say a kid going to church camp may come back home with a pretty strong seeming that God exists, but as he grows older, he is going to encounter defeaters and things that shake his strength. And he's going to have to respond to those things in some way. So they think that a mature adult theist is over time going to have thought about the world. They're going to have grown closer to God in prayer. They're maybe going to have heard an apologetics lecture at church. They're going to talk to other believers about how God's redeemed suffering in their life. They'll witness God's transformative power in their own lives, and so on and so forth. Over time, whether they know it or not, they're building up all these auxiliary beliefs that reinforce their theistic commitments and neutralize the sort of defeaters that come against them. And that bit there was me mostly reading from the book, paraphrasing some stuff, but that's almost a direct quote from the book. But it's not the bare seeming in and of itself that is that's overcoming this, right? It's not that in like the sort of Plantinga sense, we look around the world, we see the stars in the night sky, and we get a justified true belief that God exists, just generated by our faculties, right? Maybe we get that at some point, but after we get that, we get defeaters for it, and then we have to, address those defeaters and respond to them. And this seems plausible to me. He wants to make it clear, Gage and McAllister want to make it clear that they don't think that you need to be giving like formal natural theological arguments. They're not saying that you need to, they use this example, understand Plantinga's modal ontological argument. All you got to do is, have reasons, have other beliefs that act as defeaters. And you're like, right, you're bolstering the initial seeming with additional evidence. And they get a little comment in here about McNabb might be underestimating the average lay Christian a bit. They probably have better reasons and arguments, even if maybe not arguments, but better reasons and evidence beyond their initial like seeming as though God exists than you might initially think. Okay, so the second objection is Baldwin's objection that seemings can't be ultimate justifications for our beliefs. And I don't think Gage and McAllister present they don't go in depth on this as Baldwin did. Really what they say here is that if you go back enough on any chain of belief, the earliest belief you're going to get to is going to be justified by a seeming, right? And I want to make clear that these seemings aren't ultimate in the sense they can't be questioned, right? You can overturn your seemings with other evidence, but that other evidence is also going to go back to other seemings eventually also. It's just that if those seemings are better grounded and the argument is better, then whatever the seeming you're overturning is, you're good to overturn it. Seemings are prima facie reasons, but they're not ultima facie reasons for believing something. They can be overcome and overturned. They're not indubitable, and they never claim that they're indubitable. So that's not the sense in which they're ultimate. But they do want to respond to Baldwin and say, look, on any belief you have, if you go far back enough in the chain of beliefs, it's going to bottom out in something. And we think that something is a seeming. I don't think they do the best job responding to some of the nuance in Baldwin's response, but I tend to side with Gage and McAllister, even though I think Baldwin does give a sort of nuanced response and sort of some reasons to doubt that seemings might really be the foundational thing. Okay. Third response. This is the one that John Buck made on the comment to the last video as well. Is this view too liberal? Is it the fact that a stray hunch comes into your head and then you're just justified in believing some crazy thing? And they're going to say no for a couple of reasons. So, one, it's psychologically implausible that we get these strong sort of hunches out of the blue. They use the example of looking at a tree and then suddenly having a seeming that the tree is 110 years old, right? That would be really weird to suddenly have that hunch, and most people don't have hunches like that out of the blue. And they say, we certainly don't have hunches like that out of the blue. However, even if it is the case that you have someone who gets seemings and hunches like this out of the blue, there are a couple of reasons why that's not a big problem. One is those hunches probably aren't very strong seemings in the first place. Remember, seemings aren't all one of a kind. They come in various strengths. Some seemings are just indubitable, right? Some seemings like, it seems as though there's a camera in front of me, can't be doubted. Some seemings as though it seems to me I'm perceiving a camera, can't be doubted. Other seemings like, it seems there is a camera, can be doubted. Still other seemings like I've got 3 beers in my fridge are more open to doubt. And you can go further and further, right? Like seemings about certain arcane metaphysical principles might be still even more open to doubt. But the seeming provides some evidence, and that's their only claim, is that even though these seemings are open to doubt and open to interrogation, they provide some justification, some small amount of reason to accept the thing that seems true to you. And these sort of crazy beliefs, these sort of hunches that would justify ridiculous things or things out of the blue, those aren't strong sorts of beliefs, if we do have those. Secondly, those sort of crazy hunches are likely to have defeaters very quickly. That is to say, if you have a crazy hunch looking at a tree, that this tree is 110 years old, you're likely to get a defeater very quickly in your head that, wait, this isn't normally what happens when I look at trees. I don't normally get a seeming that they're a certain age. Something's fishy here. And they want to point out that when people are in new circumstances and strange things are going on, they tend to be particularly cautious. So they're going to be likely to have defeaters for these strange sort of seemings that are coming out of nowhere and justifying things. So they go back and they use DEPOE's example of the juror. So even if a juror does have a hunch that the defendant is guilty, they're going to be careful, because they've been warned many times that you don't want to convict someone unless you're sure beyond any reasonable doubt that they're guilty. You don't want to convict them on that. So they're going to be likely to put aside that hunch because they're going to have a defeater for it, right? If they think, I don't have a reason for this hunch, they have a defeater for it, and so it's a seeming that's not going to count as evidence because it has defeaters, right? And that's built into their evidence. They're going to point out here also that to the extent that their view makes it easy to get justification because it makes it easy to get seemings, it also makes it easy to get these sorts of defeaters for seemings. So it sort of balances out, they're going to say. They're going to say, sure, it might be easy to get some sort of initial justification because of a seeming, but it also makes it extremely easy to get defeaters for those things when they're not bad. One final response they're going to have here is that these sort of counterexamples, like you suddenly have a seeming that a tree is a certain age, or the juror has a seeming that the guy is just guilty, the reason these have force is because to most people they seem immediately bizarre, right? To most people, if they had these hunches, would immediately get a defeater because the hunches just seem so strange and out of the ordinary to them. So they don't think this is a serious concern because they just think, in fact, unless you're crazy, most people's seemings are reasonable, and when you have unreasonable seemings, you get defeaters right away. And finally, they don't say this, but even if you are crazy and something seems true to you, how are we supposed to judge the crazy person except from within their own head? From within the evidence that they have themselves. That might be an additional thing you could add on here, even though Gage and McAllister don't go there. Okay, so the final, or not final, I'm sorry, we got two more. So next, they're going to address the circularity issue. So they're just going to say, look, we think there was a misunderstanding here. We weren't trying to give any sort of definition of justification at all, so our definition of justification just isn't circular. What we were doing was we were giving an example of a way something can be justified. So one way to get justification is to have a seeming without a defeater, but it is not the case that the definition of justification is a seeming without a defeater. Instead, we're going to provide a definition of what we mean by justification. Here, you're justified in believing something if it's permissible to believe it, given the evidence that a person has. That's just what justified means. It doesn't reference itself. Justified just means something, a belief is justified if it's permitted to believe it, given the evidence that a person has. Or another way of putting it, it's on balance indicated true for a particular subject. And they're just going to say seemings are one of the things that can indicate the contents of a belief true, right? You can have other beliefs forming an argument to indicate something is true, but you can also have seemings that indicate the truth of a belief. And once again, they're going to point out here that these seemings vary in how strong they are. Phenomenal conservatism, that view is defined something like this, that if something seems true, then you have some evidence for it being true, right? So that's what phenomenal conservatism is. Something seems true, then you have some evidence that it's true, and since a justified true belief, or not a justified true belief, since a justified belief, since justification is having evidence, since a seeming is one form of evidence, and it's the foundational form of evidence, then it provides some justification. But they just think there was a misunderstanding here. They weren't trying to define justification in the first place. Okay, final issue, and this is the issue that Gage and McAllister think is the biggest issue with their view, that they think Oliphant, Baldwin, and DEPOE, all three bring up. And this is that their view doesn't have an objective connection to truth. And so they think the issue here is mainly going to boil down to the fact that they don't think you can have an objective connection to truth, right? Any evidence you have is explicable under certain skeptical theses, right? All of the evidence you have could be explained by you being deceived by an evil demon, or by you being a brain in the vat, or by you being in the Matrix. We have no guarantee under any view that our justifications have a connection to truth. They think at one point in time, epistemologists thought justification had to have an objective connection to truth. Descartes thought that if you followed the evidence, you could be assured that your belief was reliable. But they just don't think this is the case anymore. They don't think that a justified belief is definitely objectively reliable. They think it's definitely possible that you could be justified in believing something, but that belief is still not objectively reliable. You could be deceived somehow. So they're going to say, all we're trying to do is we're trying to say what it is to have evidence for something. Is this evidence or not? They think, well, if something seems true to you, right, even if you're being deceived, the fact that it seems true to you gives you, the observer, like the first person in this situation, some reason to believe it. And they're going to say, look, we respect the externalist project, right? We respect the idea that we want to know how it is our justifications might be objectively linked to truth. But we can never be completely sure about that. Sure, you can have some theory that light hits the eyeball, it creates a chemical reaction in the brain, but it's the light, right? It's the light bouncing off something hitting your eyeball that causes a belief, so there's an objective connection to truth there. But that's something that you don't have access to the certainty of, right? You just don't have access to that, ultimately. So we think that it very well might be the case, and probably is the case. We think all the evidence points to it being the case, that our justified beliefs are objectively linked to knowledge. And we think that the externalist project is to explain how, right, how our evidence points to true beliefs and how that objective connection is there. But from like the internalist perspective, from inside you, there's no point. You can't guarantee an objective connection to truth at all. So yes, we want to talk about how seemings might be caused by the world, or by the structure of our minds, or by the way God designed us, so that the seemings are linked to true beliefs. But we can never be sure, matter-of-factly, that that objective connection is really there. Something to explore, but it's not what we're doing here. We're just saying that even if your design faculty is your faculty's design is all screwed up, and your faculties are routinely producing seemings that are flawed and that aren't accurate, well, that's still the best you got. That's still the evidence you have. So if you want an objective connection to truth, your best bet is to follow the evidence. You don't have a guarantee that the evidence is accurate, but your best bet is to follow the evidence. And ultimately, when you go back far enough in your arguments, the bottom layer of evidence is always some sort of a seeming. It's always something that seems true. Some of those seemings are incorrigible, you can't doubt them. Others are less strong, and so you have less evidence. But the bottom layer of evidence is always a seeming. So even if that evidence isn't objectively connected to truth, it's the best we got. And it's all the evidence we have, right? And so why would we believe it's not pointing towards truth? They're going to say that there are a number of different options you have here. Either you can just withhold assent to the belief, right? You can place it at 50-50 odds. Or you can just choose to not believe it, not to believe what the evidence points to. But both of those are crazy, right? You want to believe what the evidence points to. So even though you can't be completely sure, you got to go with the evidence you have. And the evidence we have at rock bottom is our seemings. By all means, trust your incorrigible seemings over your seemings that aren't incorrigible if they come into conflict. But when your incorrigible seemings don't get you very far, and they don't get you to the external world or something else, other seemings still provide evidence, even though it's less strong. So that's basically their stance, and I think it's somewhat reasonable. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I really appreciate your comments, John Buck. I filmed the first bit of this before reading them, and then I filmed the second bit of this after reading your comments. This may be schmaltzy or whatever, but just a little bit of encouragement goes a long way for me, so I do appreciate it. I'm glad at least one person is enjoying these. And I will see whoever's watching next time when we dive into Reformed Epistemology / proper functionalism finally. Some plantiga